The snow had crusted over in the night, turning the fields outside Woelfling into a white shell that broke under boots and lay in ridges along the hedgerows. It was the first morning of 1945, but there was nothing festive about the air. The light was thin and metallic, the kind that made steel and frost look alike. The roar of artillery had rolled all night in uneven waves, moving up and down the line like weather. When the sky began to pale, the men of Company the Fumtor could see their breath hanging in front of their faces as they shifted in shallow foxholes and scraped frozen mud off their gloves. The order to move came in a voice that sounded tired and certain at the same time. They were to push forward, secure ground that a German force had been preparing in the darkness, and keep the line from bending under pressure that everyone knew was coming. The Ardennes offensive was still underway to the north, and now, here in Alsace, the enemy had opened another artery of attack. It felt less like a front, and more like a dam being probed for cracks. Charles McGillivray pulled himself up, the strap of his weapon biting into his shoulder through his coat. He had grown up where the wind came off the Atlantic, and ice stayed on the roads, so the cold did not surprise him. What surprised him was how ordinary a man could feel walking into something that might become the worst day of his life. He checked the men around him with quick, practiced glances. Some were looking straight ahead. Some watched their boots. One adjusted his helmet again and again, fingers shaky but controlled. They moved out in a staggered line, dark shapes crossing the open snow. The village sat in the distance, half hidden by a line of trees and low ground, the kind of place that meant nothing on a peacetime map and everything on a war map. Somewhere beyond those trees, German machine guns were waiting. They did not know where, not yet. That was part of the problem. The first burst came in a flat, tearing ripple from the left, a sound that sliced across the field and made men instinctively drop and dig. Snow jumped in narrow plumes. Someone shouted, "Down!" though almost everyone was already flat. A fraction of a second later, a second gun opened from the right, higher on the ground, crossing its fire with the first. The air between those two streams of bullets became a place where you could not stand up and expect to live. More guns followed, deeper in, further off. For a moment it sounded like someone had opened a zipper all along the front. Then the sound settled into a pattern. Short bursts, traversing fire, bursts again. The company was caught in it, pinned before it could properly deploy. Men tried to crawl back, sideways, anywhere that looked like it might be lower. A few did not move at all. McGillivray pressed his face into the snow and felt it burn like dry ice. He could hear rounds snapping overhead, cracking tree branches behind him. The line was supposed to advance. Instead, it lay flattened in the open, its life expectancy measured in how long German gunners could keep belts feeding into their weapons. He looked left, then right, not with the wide eyes of panic, but with the narrow search of someone building a picture. The guns weren't just somewhere ahead, they were arranged. Their fire interlocked, covering gaps, leaving no obvious lane to move through. It was not sloppy. Someone had thought about fields of fire in the dark while his men tried to sleep. Behind him, further back, there was command, artillery, other companies. But up here, where the bullets were, the immediate question was simple. How do you get men off this field alive and still have a line when the next German push comes? The answer, as he saw it, did not come from a map board or a radio. It came from the way the machine gun fire rose and fell, from the angle of the bullets hitting the snow, from the short pauses when a gunner shifted or swapped a belt. He knew one thing with clarity that cut through the noise. If those guns stayed where they were and kept doing what they were doing, Company I would bleed out in this field, and the left flank would open like an unlocked door. That was the impossibility standing in front of him on the first morning of the new year. A line of American infantry under open sky, 4 or more machine gun nests dug into the woods and hedgerows, and a mission that required movement when any movement drew a storm of lead. No one was going to come down from higher headquarters and fix it. No one was going to call time out. Reality had narrowed to this. Either the guns stopped, or his men did. Far back from the line, the war looked like arrows on a map. But along this strip of frozen ground, it had become something simpler and more brutal. Steel, distance, and a man's willingness to lift his body off the snow when bullets were looking for anything that rose too high. In the German positions, men behind the guns could see figures in brown wool scattered across the field. Through their sights, the Americans looked more like shapes than soldiers, but the gunners knew what they were. They had been told the enemy was coming, and that this time, the line must not break. They believed that. They had been taught to. For years, the men in field gray had been fed a steady diet of maps with arrows that pointed outward. The Reich was meant to expand, not contract. Even as the front lines had begun to fold back, the language from above remained rigid. This was a temporary setback, a local reversal, a phase. Now, in the winter of 1944-45, the words had changed shape but not tone. Counteroffensive, last chance, decisive blow. In the Ardennes, they had struck hard and deep, and even if the thrust had stalled, the idea was still alive in orders and speeches. The enemy was soft. The enemy would break if hammered fast enough and unexpectedly enough. In dugouts and briefing rooms, officers traced arcs along the Western Front, describing where Allied forces were thin, where divisions had been rotated, where the Americans might be slower to react. They marked spots like the one near Woelfling as opportunities, rolling country, patches of forest, ground that could be held with a relatively small number of men if those men had the right tools and the right belief about the outcome. The belief was simple. If you placed machine guns correctly and fed them ammunition, infantry in the open would not pass. It was not arrogance, it was arithmetic based on years of war. They had seen attacks collapse when caught in crossing fires, platoons shredded before they reached the next hedgerow. The machine gun, in German doctrine, was not an accessory to the rifle squad. It was the center of gravity. The rest of the platoon existed to support the gun, so they had spent the night working with picks and shovels in frozen earth, carving out low positions, piling up what cover they could find, stringing wire, checking lines of sight. They had taken their orders from officers who spoke with calm determination about duty, about holding ground the fatherland needed, about showing once more that German discipline and firepower could outmatch whatever the Americans brought. The men believed, too, in their training. They had been shown how to sight a gun to sweep a field, how to cross fires so that no man could move from one patch of cover to another without being exposed. They trusted the tripods, the mechanisms, the steady beat of a well-handled weapon. They trusted the belts of ammunition stacked in the mud beside them, boxes ready to be opened as soon as the first was spent. They believed in something else, harder to name, that the Americans, for all their equipment and material, were blunt, that they relied on mass, on air power, on artillery, that if you hit them at close quarters with well-placed automatic fire, they would drop, hesitate, and pull back to call for more guns and more planes. This belief had been reinforced in scattered engagements, in stories passed along the line. The Americans were brave enough, but they were methodical. They did not, as a rule, hurl themselves repeatedly into fire once they had seen what it could do. So when the shapes came out across the snow and the orders were passed in low, clipped German, when the first gun opened and the others followed, the men behind the triggers felt the familiar tightening in their chests that came with combat. But underneath it, there was something else. Expectation. This is how it works. This is how it always works when the guns are well sighted and the fields of fire have been walked in. In a command post further back, a younger officer ran a finger along a line on a map and listened to the distant, faintly muffled rhythm of his own machine guns. He pictured the Americans flattening, trying to crawl in the open, calling on their radios for help that would come too late to save the ones now exposed. If the guns held, the Americans would have to respect this sector, move cautiously, commit more. Every delay, every hesitation, bought time for the larger plan. The plan depended on multiple such points of resistance behaving as expected. It depended on units like these, with their guns and their trenches and their drilled movements, producing predictable results. They did not know how thin their reserves truly were. They did not see the fuel shortages at army level, the gaps in the replacement pipeline, the fraying of the logistical net that had once seemed strong enough to stretch across continents. From their vantage point, tactical success still looked like a lever that could move the war. The machine guns were the symbol and instrument of that belief. As long as they were firing, as long as the barrels could be swapped when they overheated, as long as belts could be fed into the receivers, the line felt solid. Only small signals hinted that the larger story was different now. The artillery that answered their calls took longer to speak. The trucks bringing ammunition came less frequently. Some replacements were older or younger than they ought to be. The uniforms did not always fit right. The boots were sometimes of mixed patterns. But the guns were still there, solid and familiar under their gloved hands. That was what mattered, they told themselves. That was what would decide this morning. It was not arrogance in the simple sense. It was a kind of tunnel vision built from doctrine, necessity, and years of fighting. They looked out at the Americans on the snow and saw, not individuals with their own stories, but targets in the lethal geometry they had been trained to construct. What they did not see, not yet, was that the men lying out there had spent years building a very different kind of geometry. One that did not hinge entirely on the firepower of a single weapon, but on the ability of a single man, in the right place and with the right initiative, to redraw the lines. Back on the American side, the company commander was pressing his radio handset against his ear with one gloved hand and holding his helmet with the other. The words he shouted were half swallowed by the noise of gunfire, but the intent was clear enough. They could not stay where they were, and they could not advance in a straight line into the teeth of those guns. Somewhere between those two impossibilities, a new shape of action had to be found. McGillivray listened as much to what was not being said as to what was. The sergeant's role in that army, in that war, was to translate impossible orders into specific movements that kept men alive and missions from collapsing. He had come to the United States as a boy, working ships out of Nova Scotia, had taken odd jobs, and learned to navigate harbors and city streets before he ever saw a drill field. The war had given him a uniform, but his sense of responsibility had been formed long before that. He knew what machine gun fire did to men who tried to outrun it. He had seen the way it turned courage into casualties. He also knew something else. The weapons on his side were not the only strength the army possessed. Its real advantage lay in its ability to create and empower people like him, non-commissioned officers who could read a battlefield in moments and act without waiting for a script. Training had been long and repetitive. Live fire ranges, field problems, exercises where one line attacked and another defended, under the watchful eyes of instructors who cared about spacing, angles of advance, the way squads fanned out when they left cover. They had learned to move under fire in short rushes, to bound by fire teams, to trust each other to look left and right. New recruits had been drilled until they could perform these actions almost on instinct. Behind that was something larger still. The rifles in their hands, the mortars further back, the artillery that could be called on when there was time. These were the visible tips of a logistical structure that reached back across France, across the Atlantic, into factories and training camps. The United States had poured steel, powder, food, and fuel into Europe in quantities that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. It was not just the presence of these resources that mattered. It was the system that moved them reliably, day after day, through ports and along roads and rails. For a man lying in the snow under machine gun fire, that might seem abstract. But it was why he carried enough grenades on his webbing. It was why his company had not run out of ammunition or medical supplies weeks earlier. It was why he could expect artillery when he called for it, more often than not. What the system could not do was silence a specific gun at a specific moment when men were pinned 10 yards from where the fire was falling. The larger machinery of war did not reach down with that kind of precision. That was left to smaller, more flexible mechanisms, squads, patrols, and occasionally individuals who chose to move when common sense said to stay flat. He began to see the firing pattern as something more than noise. One gun dominated the left, another higher swept the center. Somewhere beyond, at least 2 more covered deeper approaches. Each gun had a crew. Each crew had blind spots and habits. The positions had been dug under the constraints of darkness, frozen ground, and limited time. He could not change the larger arrangement of forces. But he could, perhaps, take one piece out of the pattern and see what happened when the rhythm broke. He pushed himself up, low, and crawled toward the left, where a dip in the ground and a clump of scrub offered slightly more cover. Snow seeped into his sleeves. He felt the familiar weight of grenades at his belt, the solid reassurance of his weapon. He told a nearby man to pass word down the line. He was going to try to get around the gun on that flank. If he could make it stop, even for a few moments, the company might shift. The words were passed along in fragments, reshaped by fear and determination as they went. Somewhere in the chain, they acquired a simple translation. The sergeant is going after the gun. No one ordered him to go. No one told him to stay. The structure he served in had been built to allow this kind of decision, to trust it. Behind him stood an army that believed not only in firepower, but in the judgment and initiative of men who were not officers. Behind that army stood a society that had, in a relatively short time, absorbed millions of citizens into uniform and given them roles that demanded more than obedience. On the other side of the line, the German gunners kept firing in measured bursts, each squeeze of the trigger adding another thread to the web they thought would hold. Between these two systems, between their beliefs about how battle would unfold, moved one man in a brown coat, leaving a faint track in the snow as he angled toward the edge of the field and the dark line of trees beyond, where the first of the guns waited, its crew still certain that the geometry they had built in the night would look the same in the morning. When he reached the cover of the trees on the flank, the sound changed. The machine gun fire was no longer an overhand barrage. It became something directional and immediate. He could hear the clatter of the nearest gun through trunks and branches, feel the slightly different timbre that came when the barrel got hot, and the crew compensated. He moved in short bursts, from tree to tree, staying low, careful not to knock ice off branches that might betray his movement. The ground was uneven here, rising and falling in small ridges. He used them the way he had been taught, as folds in the land that could hide a man-sized shape from a sightline only a meter higher. The first gun's position came into view in segments. A scrap of camouflage net frozen into a lattice, the corner of a low earthwork, the sharp, repetitive muzzle flashes that lit the air above it. He could see the cartridge cases spilling, steaming briefly before cooling, building up in a brass pile beside the weapon. The gun crew was focused outward, eyes down the sights, hands on the grips. Their world was the field in front of them, where the Americans lay. Their ears were tuned to the response of their weapon, to shouted commands from nearby positions. They were not looking into the trees behind and to the side. He closed the remaining distance with deliberate, measured movements. At this range, every misplaced step could send sound where it did not belong. When he was close enough to see individual features on the men at the gun, to distinguish the loader from the assistant gunner, he pulled the pin on a grenade and counted the beats, not aloud but in the quietened space in his head where training lived. Then he rose just enough to pitch it, a short, controlled throw into the center of the crew. The explosion was not cinematic. It was a sharp, hard crack that punched the air and sent fragments into flesh and wood and metal. The gun's staccato ceased mid-burst. For a heartbeat, there was a gap in the soundscape across the whole line. The other guns were still firing, but they had been part of a pattern. Removing one altered the feel of it. He stepped forward, weapon ready, finished what the grenade had begun, and then moved on before anyone could respond with aimed fire. The position, moments earlier, a carefully constructed node in a network of overlapping fields of fire, was now a silent shape in the trees, its potential spent. Word of that change did not travel up and down the line in any formal sense. No one announced it over the radio net. But men on the American side, who had been pressed into the snow by the weight of crossing fires, felt one stream of bullets stop. The air above a strip of the field became measurably less lethal. Heads came up fractionally higher. A squad leader somewhere cursed softly in disbelief, then started recalculating angles. McGillivray used the gap to shift deeper, angling toward where he had seen, earlier, the flicker of another muzzle through branches. The forest here was neither thick nor sparse. It was enough to break sight lines, enough to create the illusion of solitude in a space surrounded by men, embedded in their own tasks. As he moved, he carried with him more than grenades and a rifle. He carried the cumulative result of a system that had moved him from a dock in Boston to this patch of woods. Medical exams, transport orders, training cadres, rifle ranges, unit rotations, supply dumps that had kept him fed and armed and clothed through months of campaign. He was the human interface where all that metal and paperwork met the immediate problem of a machine gun that needed to stop firing. Further back, American artillery stood ready not far from their guns, waiting for calls with grids to drop shells on. Truck drivers whose names he did not know were warming engines for the next resupply run. Clerks in tents were sorting requisitions and casualty reports. None of them knew about this particular movement in the trees. They did not need to. The machine they maintained produced possibilities. It was up to people like him to choose one and act on it. He reached the second gun from an oblique angle, again using terrain and the gun crew's focus on the open field where the main body of the company lay. The actions repeated with variations: observation, approach, the heavy, familiar weight of a grenade in his palm, the metallic rattle as it left his hand, and the sudden, violent punctuation when it detonated where men and steel were joined around a weapon. By the time he found the third gun, he had switched to a captured weapon, moving faster now, the pattern of each position becoming clearer even as fatigue and cold pressed on him. At close quarters, combat narrowed to a series of discrete, violent moments. The details of who fired first, who shouted, who fell which way, blurred. What remained was the reality that another node in the German fire network had been cut. The fourth gun was the hardest. By then, the absence of previous positions must have been noticed. The Germans were not blind or stupid. Men shouted warnings, tried to reorient their defenses, to look for the source of the disruption. He moved anyway, because that was the logic of the path he had chosen. The longer the guns fired, the more strain on his company. The more positions removed, the greater the chance that some portion of the line could lift and move before the enemy reorganized. During that last approach, rounds found him. Machine gun bullets did not care about motive or intent. They tore through cloth, flesh, and bone with the same disregard. One struck his arm, and sensation changed from cold to a kind of heat that did not radiate but stabbed. Another found his body, then another. He did not stop moving until he had done what he had set out to do: break the last of the guns he could reach. The price was immediate and undeniable. When he looked down, the limb that had thrown grenades and steadied a rifle was no longer whole. Blood met snow and turned it into something that looked almost abstract for a moment, red against white, like paint spilled on a blank surface. He did what training and sheer refusal to quit told him to do. He pressed the wound into the freezing ground, using the cold as a crude tourniquet, forcing the stump into the snow until the sharpness of ice gave way to numbness. Above him, the sound of machine guns had thinned to something less than it had been. Between bursts and scattered shots, there was space now. A different kind of silence. Across the field, in foxholes and shallow depressions, men in brown coats began to move their heads higher, then their shoulders, then their bodies. Some advanced by inches at first, then by yards. The left, once completely suppressed, had air around it. Small groups started to edge forward, using every fold in the land. The company, still very much under fire, but no longer held flat by a perfect web of bullets, began to breathe again. In the German positions, the change was palpable. A gun that had anchored the left was gone. The ones it had interlocked with were suddenly exposed on their flanks in ways they had not anticipated. Men shouted to cover gaps, to turn weapons where they had not been aimed before. The geometry drawn the night before under lantern light was distorting. A young officer, listening to the pattern of fire on that sector, heard something he did not like. Absence. One of his guns was no longer contributing its share of sound. Then another. Reports came in fragments, overstrained field telephones, from runners who had to cross ground that was no longer safe. A position overrun, a crew out of action, unknown enemy movement in the woods. This was what it felt like when an army built on rigid plans ran headlong into a different kind of force. Not superior numbers, at least not in that one patch of ground, but a different understanding of how to absorb initiative from below. In that moment, the belief that well-sighted machine guns would hold against any frontal attack collided with the reality that not every attack had to stay frontal. The assumption that Americans under fire would stay pinned until ordered otherwise met the fact that one of them had gotten up without waiting. As word of the disrupted positions spread up and down the line, as officers and NCOs tried to salvage their fields of fire, the men behind the remaining guns felt something erode that had nothing to do with ammunition or barrel life. It was the quiet confidence that the geometry was on their side. Later, after men on both sides had been evacuated, after medics had done what they could in aid stations and surgeons in field hospitals, after citations had been written and signed far from the sounds and smells of that morning, someone would sit down and calculate what had happened in more abstract terms. They would note the number of machine gun positions that had been put out of action by a single non-commissioned officer. They would correlate that with the reduction in casualties for his company, with the ground gained, with the stability of the line on that flank during a critical period in the winter campaign. They would weigh this against the steady, grinding pressure of German offensives that were already running out of fuel, both literal and metaphorical. They would draw graphs showing American production of small arms, artillery pieces, trucks, and aircraft. They would compare those lines to German output over the same period, noting the divergence that had begun years earlier and now was widening into a gap that could not be bridged by tactical cleverness alone. They would look at training pipelines. How many infantrymen could be prepared in a month? How many sergeants could be molded out of that flow? How long it took to bring a unit up to fighting strength and keep it there. They would see, in the numbers, that the United States was rotating trained men into the line faster and more consistently than the Wehrmacht could replace its losses. They would tally fuel deliveries to frontline units, the number of functioning trucks per division, the flow of ammunition from depots to battalions. In column after column, the same pattern would emerge. On one side, a system that, despite inefficiencies and occasional failures, delivered more than enough to keep formations mobile, supplied, and flexible. On the other, a system strained past its design, constrained by bombed rail lines, depleted stocks, and an industrial base squeezed by years of total war. When they looked at engagements like the one near Woelfling, at a sergeant who had taken it upon himself to silence 4 guns, they would see more than individual bravery. They would see the manifestation of a larger equation. A man like that could only exist, and act as he did, in an army that had the depth to train him properly, the logistical stability to keep his unit functioning, and a doctrine that allowed him the latitude to move without waiting for orders that could not possibly be precise enough. On the German side, numbers told a different story. Fewer trucks per battalion, lower fuel allocations, replacements drawn from younger and older age brackets, ammunition expenditure curbed by scarcity, not planning. Machine gun crews who were still effective at their immediate task, but increasingly isolated within a broader structure whose capacity to sustain them was eroding. Defeat, when it came, would be explained in many ways. Failed offensives, poor strategic decisions, overwhelming enemy resources. But underneath those narratives lay something colder. Ratios, outputs, throughput, cycles of maintenance that could no longer be met. A front line that still had teeth in places, but whose spine was weakening. In that sense, the fate of those 4 machine guns, and the men around them had been decided long before McGillivray left his foxhole and crawled into the trees. Their removal was a moment, vivid and bloody, in a process that spreadsheets and logistics officers could have predicted months earlier. The war was being decided in steel mills and assembly plants, in rail yards and at docks, in training camps and staff offices that fed a constant, reliable flow of men and materiel to units like Company I. What happened that morning was not an exception that defied the mathematics. It was an instance of it, given a human face and a specific time and place. January 1st, 1945, near Woelfling, when one man's decision intersected with an opponent whose system could no longer absorb such disruptions without consequence. After the shooting stopped and the front shifted onward, the field where snow had been torn and stained began to look like other battlefields in winter. Shell holes softened at the edges as later storms filled them in. Scattered bits of webbing, metal, and wood were collected or buried. In time, grass would grow where men had crawled and bled. The geometry of machine gun fire, so sharply defined that morning, would fade from the landscape. For the man who had moved through the trees, the war did not end on that field. It continued in corridors lined with stretchers, in the controlled brightness of operating rooms, in the slow, determined work of relearning balance and movement with one arm gone. He carried the memory of that morning with him, not as a legend, but as a series of very clear, specific images. The angle of a gun, the weight of a grenade, the feel of snow under his hands when he pressed the wound down to stop the bleeding. Years later, he would stand in a room where the air was still and conditioned, where walls were high and adorned with symbols of a nation at peace. He would receive a medal from a president whose own war had been fought mainly at the level of maps and policy. The citation would be read in a measured voice, summarizing actions that had taken minutes in phrases that had taken weeks to craft. The word gallantry would be used, and above and beyond the call of duty. For some listening, it would sound like a story of individual heroism against odds. For others, particularly those who had known fields like the one near Woelfling, it would also sound like something else. A description of how a large, impersonal conflict occasionally focused into a point where choice and consequence were concentrated into a single human being. In the years that followed, he worked in civilian roles that kept him within systems rather than above them. Customs, veterans organizations, efforts to support men whose bodies and minds carried fragments of the war home. He spoke, when asked, about that morning, but more often he spoke about the people around him, about units, about the structure that had made it possible for him to do what he had done, and for others to do things as hard or harder without ever standing in a room with a medal. Time changed the context in which people heard his story. The war shifted from lived memory to history, then to something younger generations encountered in books, documentaries, and images. Tanks and rifles that had once seemed modern became museum pieces. The maps with arrows were redrawn in atlases. But in certain households, particularly among men who had turned wrenches, driven trucks, flown cargo aircraft, or stood watch on cold nights in their own service, details like the placement of a machine gun in a tree line or the decision of a sergeant to move under fire remained vivid and comprehensible. They understood, perhaps better than any citation could convey, that what happened near Woelfling was not a myth. It was an outcome produced at the intersection of human will and organized capacity. It spoke to the danger of believing that technology and doctrine alone could guarantee results, and to the importance of building systems that could absorb and amplify the judgment of individuals. The lesson, if there was one that reached beyond that frozen field, lay somewhere in the distance between two kinds of certainty. On one side, the belief that guns placed in the right positions would turn any attack into slaughter. On the other, the quiet confidence that you could train and equip men so that, when the moment came, one of them would see a way around those guns and act without waiting for permission. The war itself ended, formally, with signatures and broadcasts, with cities illuminated and flags raised. Its residue remained in bodies, in memories, in landscapes where the soil still held metal. It remained, too, in the way militaries and nations thought about power, not just as blast and velocity, but as organization, production, and the ability to steer countless small decisions toward a common aim. On a winter morning long after the guns had fallen silent, visitors might walk past a headstone in a national cemetery and read a name, a rank, a date, and a brief indication that the man beneath had once worn the country's highest decoration for valor. They might pause, or they might move on. The stone would not tell them about the lines of fire near Woelfling, or the way snow looked when warmed by blood, or the feel of a rifle in cold hands. But for those who knew the story, the image would remain. A field under a thin, metallic light. A company pinned by machine guns whose crews believed their geometry would hold. And one man standing up into a storm he fully understood, not because he thought he could rewrite the war, but because he could see, in that moment, a way to change the shape of the next few minutes for the men beside him. Those minutes, multiplied by thousands of similar acts in thousands of other places, became part of the reason the war ended as it did. Not as a sudden collapse, but as the final, inevitable result of systems and people pushing against each other until one side's numbers, organization, and choices could no longer be matched. In that sense, the path he cut through the trees that morning was one of many threads in a vast, dense fabric. It mattered precisely because it was both unique and representative. A single, specific instance of courage woven into a pattern dictated by steel, oil, time, and the stubborn refusal of men to let each other die without trying to redraw the lines.